Now, here's a few things you almost never hear from government ministers of any political party at any time. I don't know, I don't care, I don't have an opinion on that. I'm not sure what the answer is. At the end of a week or so in which David Cameron has had to restate his views on history and America's role in World War II, plus his misstatement on Iran and whether it has nuclear weapons, plus the allegations he was naive to criticise Pakistan while in India, we wondered whether we expect too much of our politicians. Do we think they can pick up a ministerial brief at the drop of a hat? Here with the wisdom of experience, I'm joined by two former ministers. From Glasgow, Tom Harris, who as a minister was expected to become a transport expert, and Peter Lilley, who was at the Treasury, DTI and Department of Social Security. Tom Harris, I mean, was it a bit of a shock when one minute you're in the back benches, the next minute you're in the Department of Transport, and then everybody assumes, presumably, you're an expert?
Well, yes. I mean, after the initial elation of being phoned by the Prime Minister and being told that I was going to be a minister, there then follows, and it's the same for every minister, a very, very intense few days of briefing on, and in my case, a very, very technical area. And you've really got to spend an awful lot of time, learning your brief and make sure that you know more than whatever opponent you're facing at any particular time.
But is it good advice to the new boys or new girls at that point just to shut up, say nothing and read your books?
Well, in the Commons, for instance, if any minister is asked a question which they genuinely cannot think of an answer for, the best thing to do, the only thing to do really, is simply to say, I will write to the honourable gentleman. But if you try to make something up, you're in deep, deep trouble very quickly.
Peter Lilley, don't make things up. But I mean, you were in the city before coming to the
Yes.
Treasury, so presumably you were prepared up to a point.
Yes, I was, and I'd also been the Chancellor's PPS for 4 years before I became a Treasury Minister. Even so, it was very different being a minister from being someone who merely carried the bags of a minister. And I probably got quite a lot of things wrong in my first few months, but no one noticed except me.
Well, didn't your civil servants notice? Because, I mean, they're obviously, on the one hand, they're a trusted guide. On the other hand, there's the yes minister. They're actually telling you what you think.
Yes, after I'd been there a few months, I did carry out a sort of personal audit of some of the decisions I'd taken. And I found the one I clearly got wrong, but no one had criticised me for, was the one I'd based on my own experience of an area where I knew a lot from my city experience before. So actually you're better off when you take a notice of your civil servants, and you're more likely to make mistakes if you ignore them and think you know it all already.
Tom Harris, I wondered if you had some sympathy for the new Transport Secretary, Philip Hammond, because he is somebody who is widely regarded on both sides of the House of Commons, somebody who'd studied a lot about the Treasury and public spending, and then, such as fate, he turns up at the Transport Department having to learn the brief that you had to learn.
But that's politics, and he wouldn't have been at all surprised at that. And I told him, I'm a member of the Transport Select Committee, and we interviewed Philip just last week, and the first thing I said to him was, I think you landed on your feet. It's a much better job being the Transport Secretary than being Chief Secretary of the Treasury. But this happens to every minister, and this time next year, Philip Hammond could be in a completely different ministry, and not necessarily one that he has swatted up for. That's just the way politics works. And once you are dropped in at the deep end, you have to depend on your civil service to give you the briefing, and you've got to learn very, very quickly. It's the only job in the world where you have to do that.
Peter Lilley, the start of this conversation, I suggested it's very difficult for you in office to say, I don't know. I mean, Tom said you can always say, I will write to the honourable member about that. But would it benefit our public discourse if ministers occasionally did say, well, I haven't really thought of it, I haven't studied that, I'll have to look into it, and kind of confess to that?
I think you can do that at public meetings, funnily enough. You can say, I don't know. You can say it once. You might even be able to say it twice. If you say it 3 times, then everybody thinks, who's this chap? Why is he a minister? But you can't do that at question time, because you've had some advance notice of the questions. If you're not, the Prime Minister doesn't, but all other departmental ministers do. So you swat it up on that area. And if you haven't even been able to swat up on the issues that are on the order paper, then you're not much good.
Tom Harris, I mean, the Prime Minister has obviously hit the ground running as well on a lot of this. And some of those things, the slight confusion about 1940 as opposed to 1940s, they're kind of forgivable errors, aren't they? We could all make that mistake.
I think what the Prime Minister has done, and he made the same mistake as his predecessor, which was to assume in advance that the job of Prime Minister was much easier than it actually is in reality. And I've got some sympathy for David Cameron and some of the gaffes that he's made. He's under an incredible amount of pressure. But the one on Iran having a nuclear weapon, that does surprise me, because you don't have to be an expert on foreign policy or the Middle East to know what the situation is in Iran. All you have to do is have, if you've read the newspaper at all in the past year, you'll know exactly what the situation is. I was very surprised that he made that mistake. I think it was more than just a silly gaff thinking on his feet. I think that was quite a serious one, and I think you have to get a grip on that quite quickly.
Do you agree with that point?
It was very surprising coming from David Cameron, because he always had an absolute fabulous command of detail. He's got a photographic memory, and he's got very good recall. And as everybody knows roughly what the situation is in Iran, so I think it must have been a slip of the tongue, or thinking ahead to the next thing and not completing that sentence properly.
But I suppose the important thing is what we expect from you lot, as
Yeah.
it were. I mean, perhaps we do expect, again, to go back to what we started this conversation on, we do expect you to be not quite infallible, but you to get it right.
Yes, and it is much more difficult for a Prime Minister than a departmental minister. Departmental ministers get advanced knowledge of the questions they're going to be asked in Parliament, have a much narrower range of focus, whereas the Prime Minister has to be responsible for everything and answer questions about anything. So it'd be astonishing if they didn't make the occasional gaffe.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.